Panzers, Stukas, Blitzkrieg, these are the images attached to the German invasion of Poland in 1939. The Luftwaffe spearheads the assault with deadly pinpoint attacks, sirens and close cooperation with the German tanks to destroy the Polish army and its morale. Well, that is what the popular myths say. Now let's put that to the test. Welcome to the Luftwaffe at War. The Battle of Poland. There is so much to talk about. From its fight against the Polish Air Force, to supporting the German army, to bombing Polish cities, to the individual learnings of bombers, Stuka and Fightergruppen, in this video I will give you a detailed insights into the Luftwaffe over Poland. And then in the future I will expand with more episodes as I put the lens on all the granular detail of a campaign that showed the strengths and weaknesses of the Luftwaffe. Though many, yes many, were hidden at the time. After the occupation of what remained of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, Poland was the next target for German expansion. In earnest, plans were drawn up. Core to the plan were two major assumptions. First, that the Western powers, mainly France and Britain, and the Soviet Union would remain neutral, and second, that the attack would come in full surprise. And the Soviet Union, of course, with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, became an ally for now. To understand the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Poland, we don't need to know every detail of the ground war, but it is important that we have a handle on the basics. For the invasion, Germany organized itself into two army groups: Armeegruppe Nord, or Army Group North, and Armeegruppe Süd, Army Group South. Luftflotte 1 supported Army Group North under command of General Fedor von Bock. This was composed of Georg von Klucher's 3rd Army and General Gunther von Kluge's 4th Army. The 3rd Army was to strike southward from East Prussia, assisting the southeastward attack of the 4th Army, which struck from the direction of the Baltic Sea. Luftflotte 4 supported Army Group South, commanded by General Gerd von Rundstedt. It was placed on the southwestern border of Poland. Included from north to south was Blaskowitz's 8th Army, von Reichenau 10th Army and List's 14th Army. This was the main drive in a northeasterly direction towards Warsaw with the 8th and 10th Army, while the Slovak Army was to punch north to bind the Polish Carpathian positions. And as that happens, the German 14th Army was to strike into the flank of the southern Polish formation. For the attack on Poland, the Luftwaffe mustered around 4,100 aircraft, with 3,650 operational. The vast majority of these, about 70%, were set to push east into Poland. The rest was to remain in reserve in Germany. Let's go through these numbers. In this fleet we have 770 fighters, mainly Bf-109Ds and Es. Add to that 400 Zerstörers, although this force actually includes some 300 older Bf-109s as a stand-in for the 110 that had yet to be delivered. Then came the main bulk of the force, 1,180 bombers, with around 750 modern Heinkel 111s. Attached to these were 360 Ju-87 dive bombers. The force was rounded off by about 650 reconnaissance aircraft, 550 Ju-52 transporters, and 40 close air support aircraft, the outdated Henschel 123. Both Luftflotte 1 and 4 formed a small support formation for the army, composed mainly of Ju-87s. For Army Group North and South, this formation was about 100 and 150 aircraft respectively. These formations were to directly support the army, and nowadays paint the popular memory of the campaign. But, as so often, reality and popular memory are different. More on that later. Against this force stood a moderately sized Polish Air Force with largely outdated aircraft. Of about 1,900 aircraft, 1,300 were either obsolete, non-operational or trainer aircraft. The actual frontline strength was about 160 fighters,
110 light bombers, and just under 40 medium bombers, with another 200 reconnaissance and support aircraft. In essence, the Germans outnumbered the Poles by a wide margin. The Poles had also partitioned their force into strategic aviation and army aviation. The larger force of 250 aircraft was army aviation. It fielded the outdated but maneuverable P-11 fighter and the P-23 light bomber. The 150 aircraft of strategic aviation were about 50 fighters defending Warsaw and the remaining P-23s, as well as the P-37 medium bomber. The P-37 was an interesting machine, and it actually ranks amongst the most modern medium bombers of 1939, yet at this time Poland had barely 40 of them. In addition, Poland fielded 40mm Bofors and 75mm anti-aircraft guns for point defense. Through intelligence gathering, especially a high volume of high-altitude reconnaissance flights in August 1939, the Germans were able to build a fairly accurate picture of the Polish air strength. It ultimately considered that, quote, "It is not expected that the Polish air units will have a decisive effect on the course of the war," end quote. And with that Luftwaffe assessment, let's turn to the actual campaign. You will remember from a previous episode, the Luftwaffe had three main tasks: achieve control of the air, support decisive operations of the Army and Navy, and destroy the enemy's centers of power. And talking of other episodes, my research, including all archive strips, are supported by patrons and channel members. Supporters get upcoming episodes early, can vote on topics, and have priority access to Q&As. And you can get these bonuses too by signing up on patreon.com/milavhistory or via YouTube memberships on Military Aviation History. And thanks to Beverly and Wojciech who recently signed up. During the Poland campaign, the Luftwaffe wanted to follow this broad tasking order. But was it successful? Let's find out with a few case studies. You may have heard of the Gleitwitz incident, a false flag operation on the 31st of August 1939, which Germany used as a pretense to attack Poland. Long story short, the German SS dressed a few of their own in Polish uniforms and staged an attack on a German radio tower. It seems that even back then, no one in the international sphere actually bought this pretense, but the Germans went ahead anyway and attacked. German Stukas struck the opening blow on the 1st of September 1939. At 4:30 in the morning, a Staffel vom Sturzkampfgeschwader 1 attacked the bridges at Tczew in the aim of destroying the wires that Polish pioneers had laid to explosive. The Stukas failed and the bridge was blown up. 10 minutes later, further south at Wieluń, that's Walloon, this city was bombed by about 50 to 60 Stukas of STG-76 and STG-77. Another bombing with Stukas followed. This attack on Walloon is subject to some discussion to this very day. First off, the exact time it took place. Yes, historians still argue about the time and whether Poland and Germany use different time zones. The Polish National Museum of Remembrance says that the attack took place at 5:40 in the morning, so I will defer to them. More importantly, however, most historians argue that the city presented no real military value. Walloon was simply on the path of Army Group South, and perhaps the Luftwaffe assumed that it was a staging point for the Polish army. Yet even General von Richthofen, who ordered the attack, had never really given a valid reason. In the operational reports of the Luftwaffe, attacks on Polish towns and cities were often described in the following manner. Quote, "Attacks on towns and villages are always effective. In addition to the material effect, there is an increased morale effect, which greatly impairs the enemy's will to resist." End quote. One bomber unit, Kampfgeschwader 27, commented that the material destruction that it caused in cities came at a cost. Quote, "A large amount of ammunition was required to destroy villages. One Gruppe had to be deployed twice to destroy Lomza." End quote. I have many such entries. They are part and parcel of this and later campaigns, and it's not surprising that soldiers are first and foremost interested in the practical matter of bomb damage assessment and the amount of ordnance used, rather than the morality behind it all. Walloon meanwhile suffered 380 bomber hits, with a combined yield of 46 tons. The Polish Museum of Remembrance confirms 127 dead, but the grey figure beyond that likely adds a few hundred. This attack is symbolic of many more bombings of Polish cities in the coming weeks, and soon both sides used these attacks for propaganda. It's an important subject that I want to discuss in a dedicated episode in the future. So, we have the opening blow that was delivered on the 1st of September 1939. On the opening day of the invasion, the Luftwaffe then concentrates its mass against the Polish Air Force. Doctrine dictated control of the air had to be achieved, and the Germans were successful, but via a detour. They did not destroy the Polish Air Force outright, which had dispersed to secondary airfields the day before the invasion. To make matters worse for the Luftwaffe, weather also affected its operations. For example, on the opening attack against the airfields at Lodz, Sadkov and Kielce, only 31 out of 88 aircraft actually made it there. And when they found the target, the Luftwaffe, much to the annoyance of the Germans, hit empty fields and would, over the course of the campaign, actually only destroy about 24 Polish aircrafts on the ground. So how does that make the Luftwaffe successful? Well, I said it was successful via a detour. The Polish planes survived, but the primary airfields, their facilities, their stockpiles and maintenance infrastructure did not. As the German army advanced, these were also captured. Polish dispersal also disrupted the cohesiveness of the Polish command structure, which now had a hard time organizing any effective response. As always, air power is more than just the planes and the pilots. When command and communication lines are broken, organized resistance becomes unlikely. And equally, bases and stockpiles are critically important to maintain sorties, and when they become limited or destroyed, as was the case with the opening attacks of the Luftwaffe on Polish airfields, things go south with terminal velocity. In sum, Polish planes survived the opening strike, but the Air Force had no ability to organize or sustain operations, never mind supplying, repairing or replacing airframes. And when they did go up against the Germans, they fought greater numbers in better machines. The fact that they tried at times to take the fight to the Luftwaffe speaks highly of the fighting spirit of the Polish Air Force in those days. Yet realistically, there was little that could be done. In the words of historian Rode, quote, "Provided that they had not been shot down, the Polish pilots only rarely engaged in combats and dispersed to remote airfields." End quote. However, when they engaged, Polish pilots really went for it. There are two examples that give you an idea. On the first day of the invasion, Göring decided a special show of force was needed and wanted to send many German bombers against Warsaw in Angriff Wasserkante. This is where we find one of the first mysteries that took me some time in the archives to piece together. Poland claimed 16 kills against German bombers, losing 10 fighters themselves. I tried to verify these numbers as a matter of course, but that actually took some digging, as every book and article in English suggests Wasserkante was carried out, but none of them say by which unit. So I started consulting the German records that survive, one unit after the other, but I couldn't really find any direct information. An overall report suggests that 10 bomber losses were suffered on that very day, not just in this attack, but across the whole day. But the more interesting find was Wasserkante had been cancelled and never took place, confirming something that I had only previously found in one German history book. So how can an attack that was cancelled and never took place somehow have been carried out? Well, fast forward a couple of hours of research and I found the answer. Yes, the Luftwaffe had cancelled Wasserkante, that is, the initial attack against the city of Warsaw, and instead it had sent a portion of 2 bomber wings to attack airfields near Warsaw. Perhaps they had also hit the city in the process. It is possible, as they attacked one of the aerodromes at Okiesie, which is actually where today's airport is located in Warsaw. However, in this attack, Warsaw was not the target. In this attack, mind you. It is likely that history conflates the intentions of this airfield raid with the original target of Wasserkante, that being the city and the industry, especially once we factor in the later raid on Warsaw that really made no distinction between those things. But more on that soon. So when the bombers appeared around Warsaw on the 1st of September to attack these airfields, the Polish Air Force engaged them immediately. I can only imagine what it must have been like to fly up in a slow and rickety old fighter armed with only a couple of machine guns and be confronted by fast, modern German bombers armed to the teeth. And then just go in guns blazing. Polish fighter pilots were, given those odds, remarkably successful across the campaign. Of the 285 aircraft, Germany loses across the campaign 126 are credited to Polish fighter pilots. But there's also a second example that shows the fighting spirit of the Polish pilots. Poland sends out 24 P-23 light bombers on the first day of hostilities to destroy a critical bridge over the Warta River. This bridge is used by the German spear tip of the 10th Army, the 1st and 4th Panzer, and destroying this bridge could seriously delay the German advance. However, these slow and low-flying bombers are the perfect target for fast-firing German 20mm AA. Half of them are shot down either straight away or written off after landing. Does this attack sound familiar? Yes, it is the kind of attack and fate that would also be repeated by French and British pilots at the Meuse in 1940. And by the way, there's an interesting fact here as well. The P-23 was used on September 2nd in the first air attack during World War II against German territories by attacking a factory at Olau, nowadays Polish Olawa. Subject to these attacks, even the Luftwaffe admitted that while Polish planes were inferior, sometimes vastly inferior, the pilots were tenacious. Indeed, not even the fall of Poland would stop this. Many would fight the Luftwaffe again soon, during the Battle of Britain. To this day, their story serves as an inspirational tale of defiance. Repeat please, indeed. However, after 5 days of fighting, Poland has lost all of its main bases to the German advance or to bombing, and up to a third of its fighters and half of its bombers. In practical terms, the Luftwaffe is thus successful in defeating Polish air power relatively quickly. Not in the manner they wanted to in an opening strike, but through their offensive counter-air campaign that was sustained against basing and stockpiles. Here is a quote from Kampfgeschwader 4. Quote, "A resounding success was achieved on September 2nd, 1939 against the main airfield in Dublin. With a rolling deployment of 13 Staffeln, 180 tons of ammunition of various types were dropped. After a local inspection of this airfield, this attack must be considered a clear success." End quote. As Poland moves its headquarters from Warsaw to Brest-Litovsk, the far more limited communication capacity of their new posting also effectively destroys any cohesive action that the Air Force can have with the Polish army. So now let us turn to how the Luftwaffe supported the overall war. Next to some support on the Polish coastlines against Polish fortification and shipping, the Luftwaffe flies at a very high tempo. It targets Polish infrastructure, headquarters, communication centers, and stockpiles in order to erode, cripple, and paralyze the Polish army. Preparatory bombardments and interdiction missions frustrate Polish troop movements and hounded retreating formations, ensuring that the Germans maintain the initiative. However, the Luftwaffe also learns that the material effect of air attacks is temporary, and that valuable targets like bridges are actually far more resilient, even when bullseyed. As Luftwaffe 1 reports, quote, "Attacks on transport routes of all kinds. The Stuka proved to be particularly effective on these. The Stuka's limit lies in the destruction of heavily constructed bridges of all types. Even direct hits do not cause these structures to collapse." End quote. Fliegerdivision 1 agreed. Quote, "Disruption of traffic on the transport routes is only achieved after a longer period of time if important lines are either permanently destroyed at one point or if many disruptions are caused on the entire route." End quote. Of course, Poland could circumvent some of the problems by moving their troops at night. As Polish General Kucheba of Army Poznan reported, quote, "We endeavored to extend the duration of troop movements by usually setting off by around 6 p.m. We experienced that the enemy's air force, which was able to perform all the tasks assigned to it during the day without any counteraction from us, tended to cease its activities in the evening hours." End quote. Thus, Poland was able to at least maneuver without fear of attacks, some of the time, but the growing fatigue and navigation limitations made this a stopgap at best. But then comes September 9th, and while everything seems to be going well for the Germans, Poland suddenly counterattacks. The Bzura counter-offensive catches the Germans off guard. Just west of Warsaw, the German 8th Army has left its northern flank exposed, and the Poles, having 9 infantry divisions in the area, aim to buy time for the defense of Warsaw to prepare and for the construction of new defenses on the Vistula River. For 2 days the Poles have success, but the Germans soon bring in reinforcements, and the local strength mounts to 19 divisions against the Polish 9. But before that happened, the German army starts to do something that it will be continuing to do until the very end of the war. They give the Luftwaffe a call for immediate support. But Luftwaffe operations don't just materialize out of nowhere with no preparation. Quote, on September 10, 1939, the Geschwader received the order to attack 50 Polish armored cars that had allegedly broken into friendly lines. It is impossible to carry out such an order. End quote. And just so you know, the last sentence was underlined in bold, and I, for one, practically hear the anger emanating from these words. But eventually, given some time to prepare, the Luftwaffe does answer. Luftwaffe formations are sent against the tight Polish positions in increasing numbers as the German army sets out to fully encircle the counteroffensive. And the increasing bombardment and hounding of Polish forces in this small area west of Warsaw must have been a display of aerial firepower that shocked Poles and Germans alike. On the 16th of September, 820 German aircraft dropped 330 tons of bombs on this pocket. The effect was so severe that even the German army sends a request to the Luftwaffe to stop the bombing, the very bombing they had asked for, likely because the German army was also on the receiving end. The Luftwaffe and Heer had so much to learn on coordinating tactical air support. The Luftwaffe itself had not been equipped for this, nor did it want to be equipped for this. And the Heer too often didn't understand the complexity of air operations. And friendly fire was one result of this, and happened at various points during the campaign. Like that one time when German Stukas attacked the bridge German panzers were crossing. With incidents like this growing in number, the Führer's intervention was needed eventually for both sides to calm down and shake hands again. As a Luftwaffe report explains, quote, direct support in ground combat can only be carried out if the attacks have been precisely ordered in advance in time and space and are incorporated into the Army's artillery fire plan. The Army must be informed that even Stukas rarely achieve direct hits against point targets such as bunkers. I always found it ironic that, as one reads the Army and Luftwaffe reports from Poland, it is so clear that neither side had really worked out on how to cooperate, communicate and coordinate with each other. Yet somehow the popular myth of the war and the Luftwaffe remains, that it was this genius of tactical air power. Von Richthofen's formation, the one that is usually given as a primary example of Luftwaffe innovation, was one small exception. The Luftwaffe did not develop air support structures until 1942, and von Richthofen and his formation, later known as Fliegerkorps 8, will feature in a future episode. But back to the fate of the Polish counterattack. The Polish defenders in the area started capitulating the day after this large German air raid, on the 17th of September 1939. That is also the day that the Soviet Union attacked, ultimately sealing the fate of Poland until 1989. Now let us go to the 25th of September. Poland, beset by both sides, by Germany and the Soviet Union, is encircled. With no large-scale relief offensive mounted by France or Britain in the West, there is nothing Poland can do. And it is on this day, with little else left to do, that the Luftwaffe targets Warsaw in what would become known as Black Monday. Over a few days, key targets had been identified and attacked. As Luftwaffe 1 reports, quote, decisive for the capitulation of Warsaw was the destruction of vital electricity, gas and water plants, which was achieved by repeated attacks by Stuka units, end quote. Yet on the 25th, the Luftwaffe basically sends any and everything it had against Warsaw, including Ju-52 transport aircraft. In 1,200 sorties, the Luftwaffe bombed and bombed and bombed, having partitioned the city under Direktive Nummer 20 between Luftwaffe 1 and 4. Soon the bombing became so heavy that the city was obscured in smoke, and the Germans dropped their ordnance with nothing but guesstimation, following a reasoning of, if I bomb the smoke, I bomb the target. Accuracy became secondary, saturation was everything. Even the Stukas no longer pressed down low in their dives to hit pinpoint targets. As Sturzkampfgeschwader 1 explains, quote, during the last missions on Warsaw, release altitudes of 2,000 meters proved to be sufficient, as entire city districts were the target, end quote. Even more telling, the Ju-52 transporters. Though the Ju-52 was classed as an auxiliary bomber by the Germans, it really wasn't useful in this role. Over Warsaw, the venerable Junkers would open their side cargo doors with airmen shoveling out small incendiary bombs. In this attack on the 25th of September 1939, the result was that the Luftwaffe destroyed around 10% of Warsaw's building, and Black Monday to this day overshadows all other bombings on Poland during the Second World War. Internationally, with the fears instilled by Guernica in the 1930s now seemingly confirmed, shock and outrage follows. As the historian Coram states, quote, "The international press reported the numbers of casualties as between 20 to 40,000 dead. In reality, sober analysis has to place the casualties and damage at a far lower level, between 6 and 7,000 dead." End quote. Even this lower number makes Warsaw into an incredibly deadly air attack against a city that at this point had virtually no defenses. Warsaw surrendered 2 days later. And as we know, that would only be the start of 6 years of fighting across Europe. For the Germans and Luftwaffe, the invasion of Poland was considered a success. A lot of the pre-war planning had paid off, and the ability of the Luftwaffe to switch targets at a high tempo and outsortie and outbomb the adversary in dedicated operations paid dividends. While the German army aggressively pushed forward, Luftwaffe operations contributed to delaying, damaging and destroying Polish installations, infrastructure, stockpiles and units. But of course, not everything went great. One of the most obvious issues on the core level is the difficulty to sustain high-intensity operations. But turns out, when you fly a lot and bomb a lot, you use up a lot of fuel and ammunition. In fact, the Luftwaffe uses up half of its ammo stock in only 4 weeks of fighting. Various Geschwaders had to artificially decrease the number of sorties flown because fuel supply and ammunition supply couldn't catch up, either because there was a lack of transportation capacity or because the units moved so often that the logistics couldn't keep up with the constant and pre-stocking of fields. The second issue, I hesitate to call it an issue because the Luftwaffe hadn't really planned for it, was Army-Luftwaffe cooperation. Pre-war, this had only existed for reconnaissance and air defense. In Poland, Army requests, the high tempo and the need to place sorties where they mattered meant that it became clear that neither side really knew much about the other. The army didn't understand the need to bundle air power in decisive attacks for lasting effect, nor did they acknowledge the preparation times required for Luftwaffe operations, or even that weather could seriously impact the air operations, or that there were limits to IFF from 2,000 meters upwards, and so on. The army saw a problem in front of it and just wanted it gone. And when artillery wasn't available, the Luftwaffe just had to do it. Now, here, immediately, without any discussion. That's not how air support works. Or, as one Luftwaffe unit put it, quote, "There is a general lack of understanding of the task, nature and performance of the Air Force within the German army." End quote. The Luftwaffe, for its part, also had great difficulty to understand why the army couldn't just mark their positions clearly, why they suddenly pushed forward in opportune moments, how army divisions and corps maneuver, and what pieces of infrastructure the army needs in order to keep up the advance, or why on-call firepower was so important. Both sides had much to learn, and that they will. And in future episodes I will discuss this in so much detail, you will wish that the Germans never went for close air support. The third issue is one that I think needs to be considered a bit more. Nowadays it is easy to say that the early lessons and mistakes of the Luftwaffe in Poland were evident and that things should have been changed immediately. Yet no military branch changes on a whim, just because this or that happened. It takes years to construct a force, to plan, to train, to develop a command staff capable of enacting a specific way of war that one aspires to from the operational to the tactical level. And the Polish campaign actually presents a dilemma to the Luftwaffe. How representative was this fight? On the whole, the Luftwaffe is happy with how things went. Some learnings on the tactical level, yes, here and there, bridges are more resilient than expected. Bombers should fly in line astern when attacking rail lines. Heinkel 111s need better radio comms. But the overall operational planning worked out. But then consider this. Poland had a far smaller army and air force than Germany. the Polish Air Force was largely absent after a week, and Polish AA defenses made an ever more modest showing as the fight went along, so the Luftwaffe could get away with attacks that were likely atypical in future campaigns. As one bomber unit puts it, quote, "The situation in Poland, where low-altitude attacks paralyzed whole areas, cannot be considered as normal." End quote. This is a dilemma. On the one hand, the quick conclusion to the campaign has the danger of glossing over those parts of the plan that didn't work out because they aren't obvious or important enough. On the other hand, if you see learnings but admit that the Polish campaigns were not representative, then it follows that the Luftwaffe wasn't truly tested, and thus one should probably not put too much stock into all of this. An interesting clash in perspective showcases this. Erste Fliegerdivision, composed out of numerous German bomber units, argued that the limited success in destroying Polish aircraft on the ground indicates that perhaps the bomber isn't suited to this. Quote, "The question arises as to whether bomber aircraft are the most effective means of combating enemy air units on the ground." End quote. Its commanding unit, however, Luftwaffe 1, counters by saying, quote, "Cannot be said and must not be spoken of that combating the enemy air force from the air is useless. In the Western theater of war, there are certainly more occupied airfields and less suitable seasonable airfields in accordance with the greater strength." End quote. You can see the problem. How representative is the campaign in 1939 for the Luftwaffe on a tactical, operational, and even strategic level? Where does it need to make changes? What do these changes cost? What does it have to give up in order to do this? And where is the data just not clear enough to support any change? No surprise then that the Luftwaffe going into France 1940 is not that significantly different to the one that we saw over Poland. Let me have one final word about this whole campaign. Since World War II, a lot of famous aircraft have found their way into museums. But a lot of them are lost to time, with only one or even no surviving example. And this is exactly what happens to all the Polish aircraft. Many survived the campaign, but then they were destroyed by their own units to prevent capture by the Germans, or sabotaged to prevent use by the Germans or by the Russians, or they were scrapped in the factories at the end of the campaign. Some made it to Romania, where they were used for a while, but none of these survive. None? Well, there is one. A single P-11 fighter is exhibited at the Polish Aviation Museum in Krakow, Poland. It flew as part of the 121st Fighter Escadrille, attached to Army Krakow, which clashed with the German 14th Army. If you are ever in the area, visit the museum and take a look at a piece of aviation history that you will find nowhere else.
Join me next time on The Luftwaffe at War as we dive deeper into the Luftwaffe's operations, aircraft and thinking during World War II. The show is written and produced by me, Christoph Bergs, and if you want to get a hold of future episodes early, vote on topics and get priority access to Q&As, become a supporter of The Luftwaffe at War at patreon.com/milAvHistory or via YouTube memberships on Military Aviation History. A big thank you goes to all the supporters for making this possible. As always, thank you for joining me today and have a great day and see you in the sky.